Hey everyone, I'm Heidi from Hands Occupied here with another knitting tutorial for you today. In this video, we are going to go over 3 different ways to keep track of your row or round count in knitting, aka how many rows or rounds you've worked on your project. The reason we're going over this today is because it's shockingly hard to keep track of your row count, especially if you're doing things like knitting row after row of stockinette stitch, especially in things like dark colored yarn. We are specifically going to go over how to use some good old scrap yarn to keep track of where we are. We're going to also talk about row counter rings as well as row counter chains. So let's dive in. The most straightforward way to count rows in knitting looks something like this. Counting each row individually, you locate a column of stitches looking like little letter V's tucked into one another, almost like a braid or a piece of wheat. You're careful to count each row, but it can be pretty easy to miscount or to miss a row. One way to keep track of your rows is by noting how many you've worked on a piece of paper or by tracking it with a counting device. I have this row counter ring from Knitter's Pride as an example here, but I grew up using a similar plastic counter that fit onto the end of my straight knitting needles. A downside of this method is forgetting to move the counter at the end of a row and having to recount the section you're knitting to confirm your counter isn't off. The ring is a nice option because it keeps the stitch count physically, literally close to where you're knitting, making it harder to forget. When I started knitting sweaters for myself, I fell in love with simply using scrap yarn to track my rows. Essentially, you're sewing a loose running stitch in between 2 columns of stitches at a consistent interval to help track how many rows you've worked. In the example you're seeing here, I'm using a multiple of 5 stitches and I'm about to knit row 25. For this method, you'll knit your row or round until you reach your scrap yarn, then draw it in between the stitch you just knit and the subsequent stitch. You can leave the tail loose or secure it to the cast-on edge if you're struggling with pulling it out. I love this method because it's cheap and you can track your rows using any multiple of stitches you wish, whether that's a simple multiple of 5 as shown here, or if you're knitting something with, say, a repeat of every 7 rows, you can track your rows that way too. Just remember which multiple you're counting with. As you can see here, we have 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 stitches worked. Hey everybody, little side tip for those of you who like using scrap yarn to count your rows in knitting. If you're knitting a garment like a sweater vest or a sweater that's seamed, when you do your cast on, particularly if it is knit from the bottom up, leave yourself an extra long tail, and that tail can double as the scrap yarn you use to count your rows. So, hot tip. More recently, I stumbled across one of my new favorite notions that's sort of a combination of the scrap yarn and row counter tool methods of row counting. This is a chain row counter from Twice Sheared Sheep. Full disclosure, I do have an affiliate relationship with them at the moment, but I signed up after realizing how frequently I was using the row counter tool in my everyday knitting myself. It features numbers 0 through 9, as well as this thing they call a melody clip for tracking what decade, so to speak, of numbers you're working on. Here's how it works. Simply knit your row until you reach your chain row counter, which can double as a stitch marker, by the way. When you reach the counter, insert the tip of your needle into the next highest numbers chain, drop the old chain, and continue knitting. When you reach a 0 number like 10, 20, or 30, you move the clip to the appropriate position. These also come in circle chains if you're working in the round and prefer that option. I'm not trying to be super pluggy here, I just have used all 3 of these methods over the years for keeping track of stockinette stitch rows and rounds in particular, and they're genuinely my favorite methods. And that was 3 easy ways to help keep track of your row count in knitting. If you have other ways that I might have missed, go ahead and share those in the comments. Give us a like if you liked what you saw, and subscribe for even more video tutorials. I've been Heidi. Thank you so much for watching.